The obsidian chamber of the Zentari Prime Governance Hall defied conventional architecture, a massive living structure that seemed to breathe with the collective anticipation of galactic power. Carved from a single metamorphic crystal harvested from the core of a neutron star, the chamber absorbed and refracted light in impossible geometries, creating an environment that was simultaneously intimidating and disorienting. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood alone at the center of this architectural marvel, her presence a stark contrast to the alien grandeur surrounding her. She wore a simple charcoal gray adaptive suit, a garment that seemed unremarkable at first glance, but was actually a complex network of quantum-responsive nanomaterials. Her dark skin and sharp features betrayed a mixed heritage, a genetic tapestry that spoke to humanity's own complex history of integration and survival. 12 holographic avatars towered above her, representing the most powerful species of the Confederacy of Stellar Nations. Each avatar was a living representation of its species' evolutionary journey, shifting, pulsing, radiating the accumulated power of millennia of interstellar dominance. To her left, the Zorn delegation materialized, a collective consciousness represented by a swirling mass of bioluminescent tendrils. Their avatar constantly shifted, revealing glimpses of complex neural networks that could process information faster than most species could comprehend a single thought. Rumors suggested the Zorn could predict galactic events centuries in advance, their political manipulations so subtle that entire civilizations could rise and fall without understanding their true architects. To her right, the crystalline form of the Archean Arbiter took shape. Unlike the other delegates, this being was the literal embodiment of the Confederacy's judicial system. A sentient algorithm composed of living crystal, capable of processing legal and diplomatic complexities across thousands of star systems simultaneously. The remaining 10 delegates represented a spectrum of evolutionary paths, so diverse that a human from just 2 centuries earlier would have considered them pure fantasy. Silicon-based intelligences that communicated through electromagnetic pulses, gaseous entities that could reshape their molecular structure at will, energy beings that existed between quantum states. And at the center of this cosmic tribunal, Elena Rodriguez, one human, no visible support, no apparent defense. A massive holographic display erupted around her, filling the chamber with star charts and strategic projections. Red warning markers highlighted the alleged human transgression, a series of colony ships that had apparently violated the most sacred of interstellar boundaries. The Archean Arbiter's crystalline voice resonated through the chamber, each word carefully modulated to communicate absolute judicial authority. Humanity stands accused of systematic violation of Confederacy Spatial Governance Protocol 7.3, subsection Delta. Your colony vessels have penetrated restricted space, violating millennia of established interstellar law. Elena's neural implant, a nearly invisible device nestled just behind her right ear, began to pulse with a soft, almost imperceptible rhythm. To the naked eye, it appeared to be nothing more than a small piece of biotechnological jewelry. But those who understood such technologies knew it was far more. A subtle smile played at the corner of her mouth, the kind of smile that suggested she wasn't just prepared, she was several moves ahead. The Zorn delegate's tendrils began to pulse with an agitated frequency. Something about the human's demeanor was fundamentally wrong. Humans were supposed to be intimidated. They were supposed to be the newest, most inexperienced species in this galactic arena. They were supposed to be predictable. But Elena Rodriguez was anything but predictable. As the holographic accusations continued to swirl around her, creating a maelstrom of projected star charts and legal documentation, she remained absolutely still. Her breathing was controlled. Her posture suggested not defiance, but a profound, almost mathematical calm. The first hint that something extraordinary was about to happen came from the smallest of details, a microscopic fluctuation in the chamber's quantum field, a barely perceptible shift in the holographic projections, the slightest change in the electromagnetic background radiation. Something was coming, and nobody in the chamber, not the Zorn, not the Archean Arbiter, not the assembled galactic powers, had any idea what was about to unfold. The trial of humanity was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same. The silence that followed the Archean Arbiter's accusation was more than mere quiet. It was a tangible force, thick with anticipation and barely contained tension. Elena Rodriguez raised her right hand, a gesture so simple yet so unexpected that it momentarily froze the entire chamber. A data crystal materialized between her fingers, not through holographic projection, but through a molecular reconstruction process so advanced it seemed to defy the laws of physics. The crystal was unlike anything the alien delegates had ever seen. A living, pulsing object that seemed to breathe with an internal light, its molecular structure constantly shifting and adapting. Governance Protocol 7.3. Elena began, her voice carrying a precision that cut through the chamber like a surgical instrument, is built on a fundamental misconception. The Zorn delegates' neural tendrils began to writhe, a sign of extreme agitation that suggested something far more complex than mere emotional response. Its collective consciousness was experiencing something unprecedented: uncertainty. The data crystal began to unfold, quite literally. Its molecular structure expanded, creating a three-dimensional map that filled the entire chamber. What had appeared to be a simple accusation of border violation now revealed itself as an intricate web of diplomatic manipulations spanning decades. Each holographic strand represented a different layer of evidence. Communication logs, resource allocation records, covert diplomatic communications, the kind of comprehensive intelligence gathering that should have been impossible for a species as young as humanity. Your accusation, Elena continued, is not just incorrect. It is a deliberately constructed falsehood, engineered by specific factions within the Confederacy to create a pretext for territorial expansion. The Krell diplomatic representative, a silicon-based intelligence that typically communicated through complex electromagnetic patterns, suddenly went rigid. Its holographic form flickered, revealing momentary vulnerability. Elena's neural implant was doing more than just processing information. It was actively reconstructing the entire diplomatic context in real time, drawing connections that would take most species centuries to comprehend. The data crystal's projection began to drill down into specific moments. A trade negotiation from 37 years ago. A seemingly innocuous resource survey conducted by a minor Confederacy exploration team. A series of diplomatic communications that, when viewed together, revealed a systematic pattern of manipulation. The humans hadn't just collected this information. They had anticipated it, prepared for it, built entire predictive models around these potential scenarios. "Let me be explicitly clear," Elena said, her voice now carrying a tone that was equal parts clinical analysis and strategic warning. The colony ships you claim violated restricted space were responding to a deliberate provocation, a test designed to assess humanity's response to artificial territorial constraints. The Archean Arbiter's crystalline form began to fracture, not physically, but in its fundamental algorithmic composition. Its perfect judicial logic was encountering something it had not predicted: a complete deconstruction of its own narrative. The Zorn delegate's collective consciousness was experiencing something close to panic. Not an emotional response, but a fundamental computational challenge. The humans had not just gathered intelligence. They had created an entirely new paradigm of information analysis. Elena's data crystal continued its relentless projection. Each new layer of information was like a precisely placed explosive, systematically dismantling the Confederacy's carefully constructed narrative. Resource allocation models, communication encryption patterns, subtle manipulations of stellar cartography. The evidence wasn't just comprehensive, it was devastating. What became clear was not just a single incident of diplomatic maneuvering, but a systematic approach to controlling emerging species. The humans weren't just another civilization to be managed. They were a fundamental threat to the existing galactic power structure. The chamber itself seemed to respond to the unfolding revelation. The obsidian walls began to subtly pulse, not with light, but with a quantum resonance that suggested the very fabric of reality was being recalibrated. As the final layers of evidence unfolded, something became terrifyingly clear to the alien delegates. The humans had not just prepared a defense. They had orchestrated an entirely new approach to interstellar diplomacy. And nothing would ever be the same again. The trial had changed. What had begun as an accusation was now a fundamental challenge to the entire existing galactic order. The moment Alina's data crystal completed its devastating projection, the first tremors of technological warfare began. It started with the smallest of anomalies, a microscopic perturbation in the quantum communication networks that connected the Confederacy's most secure systems. Most species would have missed it entirely. The Zorn, with their hyper-advanced neural networks, caught the briefest flicker of an anomaly. But by the time they registered its existence, it was already too late. Humanity's distributed quantum network was alive. The network wasn't just a communication system. It was a living, adaptive intelligence that moved through technological infrastructure like water through a complex hydraulic system. Firewalls dissolved. Encryption layers peeled away like delicate membranes. Secure communication channels became transparent conduits of information. In the governance chamber, the holographic projections began to glitch, not in the way of simple technological failure, but with an almost deliberate precision. Information fragments from classified archives began to bleed through. Diplomatic secrets that had been locked away for centuries suddenly hung in the air, visible to every delegate. The Krell delegate's communication matrix was the first to fully collapse. Its silicon-based intelligence, once considered the most secure in the galaxy, became a transparent window of vulnerability. Layers of diplomatic communications, resource allocation schemes, and covert operational plans cascaded into view, stripped of all protective encryption. Alina Rodriguez stood at the epicenter of this technological tsunami, her neural implant now fully activated. To the alien delegates, she appeared to be doing nothing, simply standing with a slight, almost imperceptible smile. But those who understood quantum technologies could see the complex web of information flowing around her, through her, beyond her. This was more than hacking. This was a fundamental reimagining of technological warfare. The Archean Arbiter's crystalline form began to fragment. Not physically. Its computational matrix was being systematically deconstructed and reconstructed in real time. Millennia of accumulated judicial algorithms were being rewritten by an intelligence that operated on an entirely different level of complexity. Across the galaxy, in systems far beyond the governance chamber, communication networks began to respond to the quantum infiltration. Automated defense systems became confused. Strategic communication relays started to broadcast information they were never meant to reveal. The very infrastructure of galactic communication was being rewritten. The Zorn delegates' collective consciousness experienced something closest to panic. Their ability to predict future events, a capability that had made them the most feared political manipulators in the galaxy, was being systematically neutralized. For the first time in their species' history, they could not see the next move. Alina's neural implant was more than a communication device. It was a living bridge between human technological intelligence and the existing galactic communication infrastructure. Each quantum pulse was a precise surgical instrument, dismantling systems that had been considered invulnerable. Backup systems failed. Redundant communication matrices collapsed. The more the alien delegates tried to respond, the more vulnerable they became. What made this infiltration truly terrifying was its selectivity. This wasn't indiscriminate destruction. It was a precise, targeted deconstruction of power structures. Specific communication channels were left intact. Certain information pathways were carefully preserved. It was as if an incredibly sophisticated surgeon was performing a complex operation on the galaxy's technological body. The governance chamber itself began to respond to this technological assault. The obsidian walls that had once seemed immutable started to shimmer, their quantum structure becoming momentarily transparent. Layers of hidden infrastructure, communication relays, defensive systems, Information storage matrices became visible. Humanity had not just developed a new technology. They had created an entirely new paradigm of technological interaction. As the infiltration reached its peak, Elena Rodriguez spoke. Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried through every compromised communication channel. "We are not here to destroy," she said. "We are here to demonstrate that there are always alternatives to the systems you believe are immutable." The quantum network pulsed, and for the first time in galactic history, the most secure communication infrastructure in existence was completely, utterly transparent. The technological warfare had begun, and humanity had just redefined the rules of engagement. The moment of technological revelation transformed into something far more dangerous, a diplomatic assault that would redefine interstellar politics. Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, her movements calculated and precise. The exposed communication networks continued to pulse around her, a living testament to humanity's technological breakthrough. But this was no mere display of technical prowess. This was strategic deconstruction on a galactic scale. The Krell delegate materialized fully, no longer a fractured hologram, but a solid representation of its silicon-based intelligence. Its crystalline form trembled as Elena began to speak, her words accompanied by a cascade of diplomatic evidence that stripped away millennia of carefully constructed political facades. "Let's discuss the Krell Resource Acquisition Protocol of 2317, Elena said, her voice carrying a clinical precision that cut through the chamber's tension. A massive holographic display unfurled, revealing a comprehensive map of resource exploitation that made the Krell's long-standing claims of ethical governance look like a carefully constructed illusion. Illegal mineral extractions, systematic displacement of emerging civilizations, covert genetic manipulation of entire planetary ecosystems. The evidence was overwhelming, presented with a level of detail that suggested years, perhaps decades, of meticulous investigation. The Zorn delegates' neural tendrils began to retract, a physiological response that translated to pure diplomatic panic. They had always prided themselves on being the ultimate political manipulators, capable of predicting and controlling galactic events centuries in advance. Now they found themselves completely exposed. But Elena wasn't finished. With each revelation, she peeled back another layer of the Confederacy's political infrastructure. The Aryan Consortium's secret genetic modification programs. The Nexus Compact's manipulated trade routes. Diplomatic agreements that had seemed ironclad were now revealed as complex webs of manipulation and control. What made the assault truly devastating was its precision. This wasn't indiscriminate exposure. Each piece of information was strategically selected, designed to create maximum diplomatic pressure, while simultaneously offering a path forward. The Archon Arbiter's crystalline form began to pulse with a desperate attempt to reassert control. Judicial protocols were being rewritten in real time, trying to contain the cascading revelations, but even its most advanced algorithmic defenses were insufficient. "You misunderstand our purpose," Elena continued, her neural implant now fully integrated with the chamber's communication systems. "We're not here to destroy. We're here to demonstrate that there are alternatives to systematic oppression." Each delegate felt the weight of her words differently. The Zorn experienced it as a computational shock, their predictive models collapsing in real time. The Krell felt it as a systematic deconstruction of their resource acquisition strategies. The Aryan Consortium saw their most carefully guarded genetic research laid bare. But beneath the exposure was something more nuanced. Elena was offering a path forward. Each revelation was accompanied by a potential solution, a way to restructure the existing galactic power dynamics that had kept emerging civilizations suppressed for millennia. The governance chamber itself seemed to respond to this diplomatic assault. The obsidian walls began to shift, their quantum structure becoming more transparent. Hidden communication relays, defensive systems, information storage matrices, all became visible. What had begun as an accusation against humanity had transformed into a comprehensive challenge to the entire existing galactic order. The Zorn delegate's collective consciousness made a final desperate attempt to regain control. Its neural tendrils expanded, trying to create a defensive computational matrix that could contain the cascading information. It failed. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of the diplomatic maelstrom, a single human representative who had just systematically dismantled the most sophisticated political infrastructure in galactic history. "We are not your enemies," she said, her final statement hanging in the air like a promise and a threat. "We are an alternative." The diplomatic landscape of the galaxy would never be the same again. The diplomatic revelations gave way to something even more terrifying: humanity's true military capabilities. As the chamber's tension reached its peak, Elena Rodriguez made a simple gesture. A holographic interface materialized around her, not through traditional projection, but through a quantum adaptive field that seemed to bend the very fabric of reality. What appeared initially as a series of simple geometric shapes began to transform. Each projection was a living, breathing representation of humanity's defense infrastructure, a system so fundamentally different from traditional military doctrine that it defied conventional understanding. Traditional warships were obsolete. Instead, the hologram revealed a network of adaptive defense platforms that existed in a state of constant quantum flux. These weren't mere weapons systems. They were living, thinking strategic entities that could reconfigure themselves instantaneously based on computational threat assessments happening millions of times per second. The Krell Military Attaché, a biomechanical entity designed to process combat scenarios with inhuman precision, went absolutely still. Its advanced sensory arrays were experiencing something impossible to categorize. Each defense platform was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. They could exist as a swarm of microscopic defensive nodes, aggregate into massive protective shields, or deconstruct themselves into specialized tactical units faster than most species could process a single tactical decision. "Your understanding of military engagement," Elena said, her voice cutting through the chamber's stunned silence, "is fundamentally limited by linear thinking." The holographic display began to demonstrate scenarios that shattered every known principle of space combat. A single human defense platform could neutralize an entire alien battle fleet, not through overwhelming force, but through unprecedented strategic complexity. The platforms weren't just adaptive. They were predictive. Each unit was connected through a quantum communication network that allowed instantaneous strategic recalculation. Where traditional military systems required centralized command, these platforms operated as a distributed intelligence, making decisions faster than any centralized system could even begin to comprehend. The Zorn delegates' neural tendrils began to pulse with a frequency that suggested pure computational terror. Their own military predictive models, once considered the most advanced in the galaxy, were being systematically dismantled by the implications of what they were witnessing. One demonstration revealed how a single platform could simultaneously create localized quantum interference fields, redirect energy weapons through impossible geometric calculations, generate adaptive defensive matrices that could reshape themselves faster than incoming projectiles could travel, communicate and coordinate across impossible distances without any detectable communication signature. The Archean Arbiter's crystalline form began to fracture, not physically, but in its fundamental computational understanding of military engagement. Millennia of established military doctrine were being rewritten in real time. Elena's neural implant was doing more than just displaying information. It was actively interfacing with the defense platform network, creating a living demonstration of human military philosophy. This wasn't about destruction. It was about strategic potential. "We do not seek conflict," Elena stated, her words carrying a weight that transcended simple diplomatic language. "We seek to demonstrate that there are alternatives to mutual destruction." The defense platforms in the holographic display began to reshape themselves. What had appeared as weapons of war transformed into complex, interconnected systems that could just as easily be used for planetary reconstruction, emergency response, or scientific exploration. The military leaders of the Confederacy realized something profound. Humanity had not developed a new type of weapon. They had developed an entirely new approach to strategic interaction. Each platform was a living testament to a fundamental reimagining of military potential. They could defend, they could protect, they could adapt. But more importantly, they could communicate and understand in ways that transcended traditional military engagement. As the demonstration reached its conclusion, the chamber was left in a state of collective shock. The military representatives of 12 different species had just witnessed the complete obsolescence of their understanding of strategic defense. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of this revelation, a single human representative who had just redefined the very concept of military potential. "We are not your enemy," she said, her final statement hanging in the air. "We are an alternative." The chamber fell into a profound silence, the kind of quiet that precedes a fundamental transformation of understanding. Elena Rodriguez didn't move. She didn't need to. Her neural implant was already weaving a complex psychological tapestry that would redefine interstellar diplomacy. What followed was not an attack. It was a profound, almost surgical understanding of each alien species' deepest psychological vulnerabilities. The Zorn delegate experienced it first, a cascading wave of computational insight that stripped away layers of collective defense mechanisms. Their species had always prided itself on predictive intelligence, on the ability to see multiple potential futures simultaneously. Now, they found themselves truly seen for the first time. Elena's approach was neither aggressive nor manipulative. It was a form of radical empathy that transcended traditional communication. For the Krell, she revealed the deep-seated ecological trauma that drove their resource acquisition strategies. Centuries of environmental collapse on their home world had created a species-wide psychological wound, a desperate need for resource security that had led to systematic exploitation of other civilizations. The holographic displays didn't just show their actions. They showed the pain behind those actions. The Aryan Consortium's genetic modification programs were laid bare, not as a condemnation, but as a complex narrative of a species terrified of its own genetic fragility. Centuries of environmental challenges had created a desperate drive to control their own evolutionary path. Each delegate experienced this psychological exposure differently. The silicon-based intelligence of the Crocs Collective felt it as a quantum-level deconstruction of their defensive algorithms. Their entire approach to interspecies interaction was built on computational barriers that were now being systematically dismantled. The gaseous entities of the Nebulon Confederacy experienced it as a kind of empathetic resonance, their molecular structures literally vibrating with the depth of understanding being presented. Elena's neural implant was doing more than just processing information. It was creating a living bridge of understanding. A communication method so advanced it was barely recognizable as communication at all. "Your strategies are not evil," she said, her voice carrying a depth that seemed to resonate beyond mere sound. "They are responses to trauma, survival mechanisms that have become outdated." Each revelation was accompanied by a potential path forward. Not a solution, but a bridge, a way of reimagining their existing strategies that didn't require complete dismantling of their cultural identity. The Zorn's predictive models, once their greatest strength, began to deconstruct. They were experiencing something impossible, a form of understanding that existed beyond linear prediction. Humanity wasn't just presenting an alternative. They were demonstrating an entirely new way of perceiving potential futures. The Archean Arbiter's crystalline form began to pulse with a frequency that suggested pure computational confusion. Its judicial algorithms were encountering something fundamentally incomprehensible, a form of strategic thinking that didn't rely on punishment or control, but on deep understanding and potential transformation. What made this psychological assault truly remarkable was its precision. This wasn't about exposure or humiliation. It was about creating a profound, almost cellular-level understanding of each species' deepest motivations. The governance chamber itself seemed to respond. The obsidian walls began to shimmer with a kind of empathetic resonance, quantum structures reflecting the deep psychological revelations being presented. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of this transformative moment. A single human representative who had just demonstrated a level of interspecies understanding that defied everything the Confederacy believed possible. "We are not here to judge," she said, her final statement hanging in the air like a promise of potential. "We are here to understand, and in understanding, to offer a different path." The psychological landscape of the galaxy would never be the same again. The moment of psychological revelation gave way to something even more profound: the systematic dismantling of galactic power structures. The governance chamber began to shift, not physically, but in its fundamental quantum structure. Political alliances that had existed for millennia started to dissolve and reform with a fluidity that defied conventional understanding. Elena Rodriguez moved like a quantum chess grandmaster, her neural implant calculating diplomatic trajectories faster than the most advanced alien computational systems could comprehend. Each movement was a strategic placement, each word a carefully constructed diplomatic catalyst. The Zorn delegation was the first to fracture. Their collective consciousness, once a unified predictive intelligence, began to split into competing perspectives. Some saw humanity's approach as an existential threat. Others recognized it as the most profound diplomatic opportunity in galactic history. A holographic projection materialized, showing the intricate web of existing power relationships. As Elena spoke, the projection began to shift, diplomatic connections flickering, some dissolving, others forming in unexpected configurations. The Krell representatives found themselves in open disagreement for the first time in their species' recorded history. Their silicon-based intelligence, typically a model of computational unity, began to diverge into multiple strategic perspectives. "Survival is not about maintaining existing structures," Elena said, her voice carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very quantum fabric of the chamber. "It's about adaptation." The Archean Arbiter's crystalline form began to fracture, not as a sign of weakness, but as a complex reconfiguration. Its judicial algorithms were rewriting themselves in real time, creating new frameworks of understanding that had been impossible moments before. Each alien delegation experienced this transformation differently. The Nebulon Confederacy, a gaseous collective of molecular intelligence, began to separate into distinct ethical streams. Some saw preservation of existing power as paramount. Others recognized the potential for fundamental transformation. The Aryan Consortium's genetic modification experts found themselves in heated debate. Their entire approach to species development was being challenged by the profound implications of humanity's demonstrated capabilities. Elena wasn't destroying these power structures. She was revealing their fundamental limitations. A series of quantum-encrypted communication channels began to activate, not through traditional means, but through a living network that seemed to exist between the conventional understanding of communication and pure information transfer. The most remarkable aspect was the precision of the diplomatic deconstruction. This wasn't a violent overthrow. It was a systematic reimagining of interstellar governance. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for centuries suddenly began to flow with unexpected potential. Trade routes long considered immutable started to reshape. Resource allocation models that had seemed carved in stone began to become fluid. The Zorn delegates' neural tendrils reached a frequency of pure computational complexity. They were experiencing something beyond prediction, a diplomatic approach that existed in a state of constant potential. "We are offering a different path," Elena continued, her words creating quantum ripples through the chamber's communication matrix. "Not conquest, not submission, potential." The chamber itself seemed to respond. The obsidian walls began to pulse with a complex quantum resonance that suggested the very fabric of galactic governance was being rewritten. Political representatives who had been bitter enemies for centuries found themselves in unexpected dialogue. The rigid hierarchies that had defined interstellar politics were dissolving, replaced by a more dynamic, fluid approach to collaboration. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of this transformative moment. A single human representative who was systematically reconstructing the entire concept of galactic governance. The fracturing was not a destruction. It was an evolution. As the final diplomatic connections began to shift, one thing became abundantly clear: nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy was being rewritten, not through force, but through the most powerful force of all: understanding. The final transformation was not what anyone expected. As the diplomatic fractures reached their peak, Elena Rodriguez stepped forward, no longer just a representative, but something entirely new. Her neural implant had become more than a technological augmentation. It was a living bridge between humanity's potential and the galaxy's future. The governance chamber itself seemed to hold its breath. "We are not here to replace," Elena began, her voice carrying a resonance that transcended traditional communication. "We are here to demonstrate an alternative." The holographic projections around her began to shift, not into weapons or strategic displays, but into living models of potential cooperation. Each projection was a dynamic ecosystem of interstellar collaboration, showing how different species could work together without subjugation or absolute control. The Zorn delegate, its collective consciousness now fractured into multiple potential perspectives, began to understand something profound. Humanity wasn't offering a new form of domination. They were presenting a fundamental reimagining of interspecies interaction. Quantum communication channels began to stabilize in entirely unexpected configurations. Trade routes that had been frozen for centuries started to pulse with new potential. Resource allocation models rewrote themselves in real time, creating pathways of mutual benefit that had previously been unimaginable. The Archean Arbiter's crystalline form underwent a complete transformation. Its judicial algorithms were no longer about punishment and control, but about understanding and potential. Millennia of rigid legal frameworks dissolved, replaced by a more adaptive, responsive system of governance. Each alien delegation experienced this moment differently. The Krell's silicon-based intelligence began to see beyond resource acquisition, recognizing the potential for mutual survival. Their computational matrices shifted from competitive algorithms to collaborative networks. The Nebulon Confederacy's gaseous molecular intelligence started to vibrate with a new frequency of understanding, a recognition that survival was not about individual preservation, but collective adaptation. The Aryan Consortium's genetic modification experts saw beyond their own existential fears, recognizing the profound potential of diverse evolutionary paths. Elena's proposal was breathtaking in its simplicity and complexity. It wasn't a new form of government. It was a new way of existing. Interstellar communication channels that had been silent for centuries began to activate, not through force or diplomatic manipulation, but through a fundamental recognition of mutual potential. Species that had been bitter enemies found themselves in unexpected dialogue. The obsidian walls of the governance chamber began to pulse with a quantum resonance that suggested the very fabric of galactic civilization was being rewritten. "We are not exceptional," Elena said, her words creating ripples of understanding that transcended traditional communication. "We are simply demonstrating what is possible when you choose understanding over control." The neural implant that had seemed like a simple technological augmentation revealed itself as something far more profound. It was a living demonstration of humanity's fundamental approach: adaptive, understanding, continuously evolving. The most powerful moment came not through grand declarations, but through subtle transformation. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for millennia began to flow. Resource allocation models became fluid. Political boundaries that had seemed immutable started to become permeable. The governance chamber was no longer a place of judgment. It had become a space of potential. As the final transformations reached their peak, something extraordinary happened. The various alien delegations, species that had been at odds for countless generations, began to see each other not as competitors, but as potential collaborators. Elena Rodriguez stood at the center of this moment of transformation. A single human representative who had just demonstrated a fundamental truth: that the most powerful force in the universe is not technology, Not military might, but understanding. The galaxy would never be the same again. And it all began with a simple choice: to understand rather than to control.